friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using Fly High from Lawn Fawn. So I've stamped the images out on some Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, and I'll be Copic coloring to match this picture here. This is going to be my color inspiration for our current Lawn Fanatics challenge. So I'm going to jump right in with the hot pink shade, and for that I'm using RV13, RV14, and RV17, and I'm going to color in every other section on this large hot air balloon. And I'm placing that darkest shade, the RV17, right along the lines there. Those are indicating the creases in the fabric over the structure of the hot air balloon, and so that is where I want my deepest shadows to be, in those creases. And then the part that is most puffed out, that would be where the light would hit the most, so that's where my highlight is going to be, in the center there. So once I have the RV17 laid in, I'm going to come in with the RV14 and just pull that color out a little bit, soften up the edges so I get a nice smooth blend, still making sure I leave plenty of room for a nice highlight. And I will use the RV13 for that, just fill that in. And when I started, I wasn't quite sure whether I wanted the lower part below this puffy part. I'm sorry, I don't know the terms for my hot air balloons, but that lower part, I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that in a contrasting color or if I wanted it to match. I ended up deciding to just have it match. So I'm going to go back in with my RV17, lay that in on the sides and then a little bit up at the top, and then blend toward the center with the other shades. And then while I have those markers out, I'm also going to add a few other little details. I'll do a dot on one party hat, I'm going to do a stripe on the other party hat, and then also the first little pennant banner on those two strings. I'm going to do those strings to match exactly the order of the color challenge. So the next little heart on the inspiration photo is yellow. So I'm using Y11, Y13, and Y15, and I'm going to do every other section on the smaller balloon. Just repeating that same process. Again, I'm going to do that smaller section down below with the same shades. I'm going to blend out the Y15 with the Y13 and then use the Y11 for the highlight. And then again, go back and do a few of the accessory images as well, just so I have these inspiration colors in little pops throughout the scene to really kind of drive home that color palette. Next, I'm going to do the stripes in between, and I want those to look white. So I'm going to use some light shades of blue to give a little bit of definition to those. I'm using B00 as the darkest, and then B00 for the mid-tone, and then the highlight will just be the plain white cardstock that I'm going to leave down the center. And I normally would use BG10 or BG11 for this. I just gravitate toward more of the aqua shades, but because the color palette that I'm using has two different shades of blue, and they're definitely more in the blue family than the blue-green family, I decided to mix it up today and use these shades instead. I'm also going to use them to add a bit of definition to my clouds, just adding a line along the bottom edge and then outlining a few little parts of the puff. Not the entire thing, but just kind of picking and choosing little spots to do that, and then blending out with the B00 once again and leaving the white core of the cardstock in the center. Then I'm going to darken things up to go back to that color palette, and I'm using B01, B02, and B04, and I'll do two more of these little pennant banners. I thought the B04 was a little washed out, so I'm going to do a second layer with the darkest two shades, and then continue adding, dots and stripes onto my party hats. The next heart on the inspiration photo is a darker blue, so I went with B24, B26, and B29, And again, I'll do 2 more pennant banners and also the little dots and stripes on the hats. But I'm going to have these shades in my sky as well, so we'll see more of them featured throughout the card later on. The last heart is purple, so I went with V12, V15, and V17. I'll do the last of the pennants, and also I'm going to do the white part of the polka dot party hat with the V15 and the V12. And again, I will have purple featured later on throughout the card, so we'll get more of that. So now I'm going to bring in my neutrals, which I think are always nice to add into a color palette. You know, if you can't have everything be just in those shades, you know, they really wouldn't have made sense to have an elephant or a mouse in any of those bright colors. Although if you want to make a super fun, more childish card, there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm going to add in some neutrals. I think that's always okay to bring into the mix. I use E51, E53, and E55 for the baskets. And then I'm going back in with that E55 and adding a little bit of a weave texture to the basket just to give it a little extra interest. On the smaller one, it's going to end up being covered up, but I decided to go ahead and add it anyway just for practice. And then I'm going to darken up this combo by adding in the E57 to do my mice. I am going to leave off the E51 on both of these guys, so I'm just using the darkest 3 shades there. The E53 is going to be my lightest. And I'm going to do the same thing for the mouse that is facing away from us. So just adding in those shadows with the E57, blending out with the E55. And then I'll come in with the E53 for the highlight. And then for the elephants, I'm going to switch to some warm grays. I'm going to use W00, W1, and W3. So they can be just nice and light. I almost added in the W5 as well, but I decided to just keep them on the lighter side for this card. And I did go back though and add a bit of extra depth with that W3. And then when I do the larger elephant down below, I'm going to end up doing a second coat on him just because I felt like there wasn't quite enough definition for what I prefer in my coloring. I like a little bit more of a dynamic look between the darks and the lights. So I'll go in with my first layer and add that. But then once I'm done, I'm just going to go right over all of my coloring with that second layer. And besides increasing the saturation of your coloring, it also does smooth out your blend a bit. So it's always something that I like to do when I feel like it's necessary, which is pretty often. I think it's never a bad idea to go over your images with a second layer. It just helps them look so much more blended. So once I'm done with that, I'm going to bring in RV10 and add a little pink to the mouse's ears and a little bit to their rosy cheeks. I also put a little bit into the elephant's ears, and then I'll trim these images out with their matching dyes. For the background, I'm starting with some pieces of Bristol. This first one is going to be the sky, so I'm using a whole panel, which is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. It's the same size as a card front. And I'm going to blend on some Distress Oxide inks. For the sky, I'm starting with Broken China in the center. And then I'm going to bring in Salty Ocean on the edges. And just deepen that up. That Salty Ocean is such a vibrant blue shade. I think it's a really good match for the first blue heart in that color palette from the inspiration photo. So I'm going to bring that on fairly far into the center because a lot of this is going to get covered up by my third shade. But before I get to that, I'm going to go back in with my Broken China and just smooth out that blend a bit more. And then once I'm happy with how that's looking, I'm going to deepen up the edges with a darker shade. So I'm going to bring in some Chipped Sapphire for that. So I'm going to come in all around the edges and just really darken that up. And the Chipped Sapphire is a really good shade to match the darker heart in this color palette that we're using. So I think these two together look really stunning, and also they just, you know, were the right choices for that inspiration photo. And then combined with the broken china in the center to just lighten things up a bit so it doesn't get too dark. I didn't want to have to do a ton of deep shadows on this card, so I wanted there to be a nice bright center to my sky even though the edges are darker. So I'm coming in with one last layer of the chipped sapphire just to deepen up those edges a tiny bit more. And then I'm going to do a little bit of distressing. So I'm going to bring in some water first, and I'm going to put that on an acrylic block. It just gives me a little bit more control. And I'm going to splatter that all over the background. Allow that to react with those Distress Oxide inks for maybe 30 seconds to a minute, and then I will blot those up with a paper towel. And that will lift up some of that color, so it'll leave behind little white spots, which you can use to be stars or snow or whatever you're trying to capture in your scene. For me, they're going to be stars. I'm also going to add in 2 shades of Gansai Tambi Starry Colors. I used the pearlized shade first, and then I'm using this bright gold shade as well, just to bring in a bit more of that yellow that is in the inspiration photo. I mean, this is more gold, but it has that little bit of reflective look to it that I think ties in nicely with the yellow. So I'll set that aside to dry, clean up my work surface, and now I'm using the stitched mountain borders to cut down another piece of Bristol, and I'm going to do some mountains using Wilted Violet for my first shade. So I'm going to have purple mountains, just like the song Purple Mountains Majesty, just to tie in that inspiration photo. Once again, I wanted to have more of those shades, so it really drives it home, like I said earlier. So next I'm going to bring in some seedless preserves and pull that down on the top just to really draw your attention to the stitching detail. And I'm also trying to combine some warmer and cooler shades of purple so that it kind of ties in nicely with the Copic purples that I chose as well. Then I'm going to bring in Villainous Potion for my final shade. I'm not bringing that all the way down on the panel. You can see I left a little strip of white at the very bottom. That's because it's going to be covered up later. So it just left me a place to hold on to so I don't get my fingers too inky. So once I have all of those shades on, I just went back over with a final blend, and then I'm going to distress this with some water as well. Just repeating the same process. But this time, instead of using the Gansai Tambi Starry Colors, I'm actually going to do some splatter with the Distress Oxide inks. So once I blot that up, I'm going to press some of that Villainous Potion onto the block and add a little bit of water to that to make it more fluid, and then I'll do some more splatter. So all of the little details on the background are going to just tie in really nicely together and have that same vibe. So once I'm happy with that, I'll set that one aside to dry and then bring in my next pieces, which are going to be the snow caps. And for this, I'm only adding just a touch of the broken china that was left over on the sponge. I didn't even get the ink pad back out. Just a tiny, tiny little frosty glow at the top. And then I'm going to bring in my grass, and I'm actually using the mushroom border, and this is the grassy portion. It's a 2-step die, but I'm just using the grass and not the mushrooms for this scene. So I'm going to add in some Twisted Citron Distress Oxide ink first, and then I wanted to darken that up with some Mowed Lawn. So I'm going to bring that in from the bottom because I wanted my glow to be at the top of the grass. And also I didn't want to have to blend over the grasses multiple times because they can get bent really easily if you're not careful. So was both of those reasons that made me decide to put the shadows down at the bottom. And then my third shade is going to be Lucky Clover, and Lucky Clover has a little bit of a bluish tint to it, so it really ties in with the blues that I used in the skies. So I'm going to do some same distressing to this as well, adding the water first, splattering that over the background, letting it soak in before I blot it up with the paper towel. And then for the other speckles, I'm going to go back to my darkest shade, which is the Lucky Clover. So I'm going to splatter that all over the background as well. And that is all of the pieces of my background. So once these are completely dry, I'm going to assemble the scene. I'm going to start by adding my mountains to my sky. And I did do a different design for a different card on the back of that Bristol and didn't like how it turned out, so I just saved it and reused it for this card here because you never would know the difference. It's just hidden on the back. So I've added my mountains and my grass down at the bottom, and then I'm going to take my 3 little snow caps and adhere those. Now, part of them are going to get covered up. You're only going to see little bits of them, but I still think it's nice to have on there, and I wasn't exactly sure how much of them would be covered up by the balloons, so it was safer to just add all 3, and then, you know, if they get covered up, it's no big deal. So now I'm going to pop this into my Misty so that I can work on my sentiment. I'm going to stamp in VersaFine Onyx Black ink since I'm stamping over those Distress Oxide inks. Some of the other black inks can get a little cloudy looking, so this VersaFine, it lays really nicely over the Distress Oxides. I'm stamping out Flying By to Say It's Your Birthday down at the bottom of the scene, and then I'll set that aside to dry and pop my card base in my Misty. I'm using Mermaid cardstock and then stamping in Fish Tank ink on the inside. So I did the smaller hot air balloon and both of the clouds, and then the sentiment says Sky's the limit. I'll stamp that down twice to make sure it's a nice impression, and then I'm ready to start assembling this card. So I'm going to glue my focal panel to my card front, and I'm adding that so it covers the card completely. So I'm going to squeeze the little corners together to make sure it's lined up on there nice and straight. Then I'll bring in my images, and I've added some foam tape to the back of my 2 hot air balloons, but I have not peeled off the release paper yet because I want to figure out my placement before I adhere those down permanently, because I wanted to have some of these clouds behind and some overlapping. So I'm just gonna kind of lay things out and figure it out. I knew that this small cloud I wanted kind of in the center between the 2 hot air balloons, so I went ahead and adhered that one down with some foam tape because I knew it wouldn't overlap anything, so it wasn't going to get in the way. For this larger one, I wanted it to go over the balloon, so I added a small piece of foam tape to the side that would hang over, and then liquid glue to the rest, and then I'm going to peel off the release papers and attach that. Although I did make a mistake here, and I forgot that I wanted to add in the pennant banner that I had colored. So I'm actually going to have to tear that cloud back off in a second. But before I do that, I'm going to work on my smaller balloon. So I'm going to lift that cloud back up and just adhere it where I want it. And then I can layer the yellow balloon over top. So I'm just making sure that it's lined up right where I want it. I wanted them to be spaced equally distant from the edges of the card. And then I'm going to add the pennant banner over top. And that's when I realized I was going to have to tear off the cloud to adhere the other one. I almost left it off, but because it tied in all of the colors from the challenge, I really wanted to use it. So I'm going to place that down. And then because it tore up the front of my balloon, I'm going to have to readjust where I placed that cloud. I didn't want to cover up too much of the pennant banners, so I had to place the cloud just a little bit lower than I'd originally had it. So it covered up more of that snow-capped mountain. So I would have liked it to be higher up, but that was my fault because I didn't think about the pennant banner before I glued it down, but no big deal, it's fine. So I'm going to add my elephant over on the right hand side and my mouse on the left because I want to reverse it on the hot air balloons. I wanted them to kind of line up differently because the yellow balloon is so much higher. I wanted to have the taller image down below just to have that kind of spatial balance. And then I had the smaller mouse on the left because that hot air balloon is lower to the ground. So I'm just trying to figure out where I wanted this final small cloud, and I'm going to attach it right behind the pink balloon. I just tucked it back there. And then of course I wanted to add a little bit of stickles, even though I've already got a lot of sparkle and shine from the splatter in the background. A lot of it did get covered up by the mountains, but there's still little flecks of it here and there. But I decided to just line my clouds with the stickles just in the same places where I put the coloring. So I'm just going around and adding that. And that way I'll just have a little bit of subtle sparkle when you tip this card into the light. I'll lift that up and show you what I mean there. You can see all of that shimmer. And I'll give you another peek at the inside as well. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. I really loved this color palette and I had so much fun playing with these new stamps for the first time. So if you enjoyed it too, please be sure to hit that like button and leave me a comment down below. Make sure you're subscribed if you haven't done that already. All of the products that I used will be listed and linked down below, so if you'd like to treat yourself to something, I would love for you to use them. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. You can click on either one to check them out. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I'll see you soon in another video. Bye-bye.